Welcome back, everybody. Today we are going to be taking a look at a deck from the 2006 format, which is going to be a Medicham EX-Houndoom deck. Now, this is a really cool lock deck, and it's a lot of fun to play. Not much fun to play against, but it's a lot of fun to play. Now, the main strategy of the deck is that we are going to be relying very heavily on this Houndoom to stop our opponent from playing item cards. Now, typically, when you play Pokemon, the goal of the game is to take 6 prizes, and essentially you just take those prizes in order 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. With this deck, you don't actually try to take prizes at all, especially at the start of the game. Essentially, what you want to do is you just try to set up massive knockouts all around your opponent's board, and essentially, in maybe 1 or 2 turns at the end of the game, you're going to take 3 to 6 prizes. Now, I've had games where I've taken 6 prizes in 1 turn, and that's very realistic for this deck. Now, and that's one of the, I would say, the strongest points about Houndoom is a lot of the times opponents will try very hard to play to limit their bench size and then kind of time knockouts, so Houndoom will get shut off. If you're playing against this deck, if you give me the Houndoom lock, you are never getting out of it. Now, we're going to accomplish that by using Medicham and Pure Power to essentially just spread around our opponent's board and not actually take the prize cards. Now, on top of that, Medicham EX says your opponent's Pokemon can't use any Pokemon power. So essentially, relatively easily, we are going to shut our opponents out of playing any sort of item cards, any stadium cards, and using any sort of powers. Now, Medicham does not shut off EXs, and this is important to note in the 2006 format because our opponent will still be able to use Blastoise EX. But we have some text to deal with that I'll talk about in a little bit. So essentially, that's going to be the main strategy of the deck. A side strategy of the deck is going to be POW locking your opponent. And essentially what we want to do is our opponent takes the first prize, we POW up something that's not going to really be able to hurt us, and then we just spread around it. Now, since they can't use item cards, they'll have a hard time getting out of it. They can't use Switch, they can't use Warp Point, can't attach Fluffy Berry or anything like that. So a side strategy of the deck is using Minim's Sniff Out, where essentially we are going to POW something up that can't really hurt us, they can't get out of the active spot, and then if they ever try to attach an energy to it, to retreat it, like let's say a Dark Dragonite, for example, we're just going to POW that energy back to the bench and then sniff out the POW again. Once again, this is a very annoying strategy to play against, made even worse by us using Houndoom to lock our opponent out of item cards. Now, let's go ahead and jump into the deck here and then start talking about the individual cards. Now, I play a 3/3 Medicham EX. While Medicham is the main strategy of the deck, it is not necessarily essential for the deck to get it active in the second turn of the game. It's ideal, but not necessarily essential. So we did go with a slightly thinner line to make room for some other text in the deck. Essentially, too, we want to make sure our opponent is playing a 7 prize game. So ideally, they're going to knock out, let's say, Medicham, Minim, and then we'll force them to knock out a Medicham at the end to take a total of 7 prizes. The order of that can vary. You can essentially go Minim, Medicham, but like I said, that's going to be the main strategy. The other thing is we could have games where we just force our opponent to knock out, say, 2 Medichams and then like 3 Minims, for example. So there is some variations in how we want our opponents to take the prizes, but essentially we're just going to play a 3/3 Medicham line here. I do find this to be the best Medite. Fake Out can be very good on the second turn of the game if we're not actually able to hit that Medicham, and it also does really good damage against, say, a Rocket Sneasel EX, for example. Now, Medicham EX does a little bit of everything right. 110 hit points on a stage 1 is really solid. The Pokebody, also very solid, especially in this format. It shuts off a lot of stuff, namely things like Pidgeot, Metagross Delta, Dragonite Delta, Dark Electrode, Dark Dragonite. Just does a little bit of everything, right? Pure Power, once again, is an exceptionally good attack, especially for only taking 2 energy, 2 colorless energy at that. And like I said, that'll combo really well with Houndoom. And then Sky Kick, for example, also gives us really good damage, hitting for 60 or 70 if they are fighting resistance. We can also set up knockouts with Sky Kick using Pure Power, where we can Pure Power our opponent's Pokemon into range of getting knocked out by Sky Kick. And then the last thing I kind of want to note is we are always threatening that Sky Kick damage, which I think is really, really strong, where essentially we can only commit 2 energy to Medicham, and then we're using Pure Power, but our opponent knows we are always just 1 energy away from being able to use Sky Kick. And just how they have to plan their turns because of that, and then the mental aspect to that can be very huge as well. Psychic weakness, not too bad in this format, and then a single retreat cost is actually really nice as well, because there's going to be situations where we may need to retreat that Medicham EX. We play a 2-2 Houndoom line. Playing a 1-1, we would risk prizing it, and it's too important to our strategy, and then playing a 3-3 line is just going to be too much fluff for the deck. 2-2 is going to be absolutely perfect. We went with the Smog Houndoom. This can be useful. We can't fulfill this requirement with a multi-energy, and there's going to be some decks or matchups where maybe we need to shut off a power of a Pokemon in the active spot. Smog would be able to do that. It's also a really solid attack at the start of the game, especially if our opponent opens up with some sort of EX, for example, like a Lugia EX, or something they don't want that chip damage on. Houndoom, once again, it's solid. We don't play the Fire Energy. We do play the Whole Lens Electrode, but even in a rough spot, Tight Jaw can be a really, really good attack. Now, I went with 3 Minims. This may be a little over the top. I think you can make an argument for, let's say, 2 Minims, and then that third one could be like a Pokemon Retriever or a Unseen Forces Stantler. But Minim is just such a good card. It's a really, really solid opener at the start of the game. We play so many good item cards, being able to sniff them out, and then using them on the following turn is just absolutely great for the deck. 1 Roselia. This is our mainly in there for LBS. I stole this from Mewtrick, but essentially you can flick poison the Blastoise, and our opponent can't play Switch or Warp Point to get out of it, and since the Blastoise is poisoned, they can't use the ability to drop Water Energy into play. This can also be really useful against other decks where if we don't necessarily have the POW in our hand, we can flick poison something up that our opponent can't retreat for a single energy. Then if they do commit the energy to whatever that is in the active spot, we can just flick poison something else up, and then just kind of force our opponent to drop energies, ideally in situations they don't want to. Now, we also play 1 Whole Lens Electrode. This I stole from Jason Klaczynski's Arcanine EX deck from the RSPK format. I'm going to say a lot of this deck, while the strategy is completely different, the goal of the deck is completely different, I did steal a lot of this deck from Jason Klaczynski's Arcanine EX deck for the RSPK format, but essentially the Whole Lens Electrode, we've got to play 4 Elms Training just to maximize our odds of getting that Medicham and Houndoom into play as early as possible. And then outside of that, Elms can be kind of a dead card. That Whole Lens Electrode allows us to Elms 4 in energy, and it makes it a little bit more of a live card, especially in the middle to late game. Now, going on here, we do play 4 Elms Training Method. Once again, we've got to maximize those odds, hitting the Medicham, hitting the Houndoom, grab the energy with it. 4 Rockets Admin. Once again, we aren't trying to take early prizes. Heck, we might not even try to take prizes until the last maybe 1 or 2 turns of the game. So essentially the idea behind admin is we should always be adminning ourselves to a very large hand size and adminning our opponent to a very low hand size. And essentially we want to reach the point in the game where we are just going to force our opponent out of options. 3 Copycat. Now I'm going to say these counts you can debate a little bit. Copycat seems very counterproductive if we are running a very high admin count and we're trying to put our opponent at a low hand size. But I found in a lot of situations, Houndoom locks our opponent out of so many cards. Typically, 10 to 15 cards in our opponent's deck is going to be absolutely dead under Houndoom. So essentially, it's not uncommon for them to maybe have a larger hand with nothing playable in it, and you can Copycat pretty decently. Now, we play a lot of really strong item cards in the deck, ER2, POW, Great Ball, that we can just burn right away. So I found in a lot of situations, even Copycatting for a smaller hand size, maybe just 5 or 6 cards, can be very good, considering we can play everything decent in our hand down and then just go for those fresh cards. 3 Steven's Advice. I talked about this a little bit with Arcanine, but I have found with Houndoom that opponents will try very hard to keep their bench sizes smaller. So you're not necessarily going to get as much bang for your buck with Steven's Advice in this deck as you would in maybe other decks. But I've also found in the 2006 format that decks require so much setup, it's very hard for them to keep their bench sizes super small, and most times you are going to net the same 3 cards with Steven's advice that you would with Mary's Request. Single copy of Mary's Request. Once again, I think this is debatable. I think you can make arguments to play 4 Marys and then cut your Copycat and Stevens down. I do like the single Marys in the deck. It's one more draw supporter, and it's something we can grab off Scott if that would be the right choice for the situation. Now, we play 1 copy of Scott. You could play a second in the deck. I like a single copy. We want to search out those stadiums. Get the supporters. We do play a very vast supporter lineup. We want to make sure we've got the Elms when we need it. We've got the Rockets admin when we need it. Maybe we search Stevens for a good draw on the following turn. Now, the thing about this deck that you might not have with other decks is generally once you get that Curse Stone into play, they're not going to be able to replace it. So you're not really playing a Stadium Orb with the opponent. Once that Curse Stone's good to go, you got it locked in. You're probably not going to have to find another one. But to be able to either find that first Curse Stone, or if you don't have the Houndoom lock and you do need to play that Stadium War, Scott is very good in those situations. For ER2, gotta control the energy for the opponent. This is something we can play at the start of the game, especially if our opponent's trying very hard not to give us that first prize, so we can activate the POW hand extensions. Those ER2s are super strong. I'm also going to say this combos really well with Minim, where essentially we can put Minim in the active spot, just put something in our opponent's face and say, hey, you have to deal with this. If you don't deal with this, I am just going to use Sniff Out, grab ER2 every single turn, and you got a 50-50 shot at losing whatever energy you just put into play. For POW hand extension, just so much utility with this deck. Like I said, we're almost always going to be down on prizes. We can either POW energy away from our opponent's active spot or bring up something on the bench. They're going to have a hard time getting out of the active spot. This is made even worse by the fact that we can get this back with Minim. And then with Houndoom, they can't play items to get out of it. And then we got Medicham EX, where our opponent's just not going to be able to use any abilities. They're not going to be able to quick search for something or Delta control for something to help in that situation. Just the Medicham POW combo is so strong. For Curse Stone, once again, we're playing in 2006. Almost every major deck in the format relies so heavily on powers. Getting that chip damage in with Curse Stone can be so strong, especially since Pure Power only applies 3 damage counters a turn, so sometimes we do need those that extra chip damage from Curse Stone. I'm going to say you can make a good argument in this deck to play 3 Curse Stone and then either a Battle Frontier or a Team Aqua's Hideout. The advantage with Battle Frontier is that we could lock a Battle Frontier into play while we're using Sniff Out, so our opponent still can't quick search under it. And then the advantage with Aqua's Hideout here, bring it up, is we can try to POW something in the active spot that we know our opponent can't get out of. Aqua's Hideout is going to make it harder for them to get out of it. And even though we acknowledge, hey, we're going to give you quick search, but I know you can't quick search for anything that's going to get you out of this situation, Aqua's Hideout can be really strong. The main argument would be is there's going to be situations where you want to shut Curse Stone off, where essentially they are taking so much chip damage from Curse Stone, you don't actually want something to get knocked out because you don't want them to be able to lower their bench size that way. The reason that I play for Curse Stone is because generally you want to see Curse Stone early, you want to see it often in this format, and essentially you can play smart with Pure Power where you can still time the knockouts right. But I think there is a good argument to drop the Curse Stone, drop a single Curse Stone, and then play, like I said, an Aqua's Hideout or Battle Frontier. 3 Great Ball. We want to find those basics early, whether that's a Medite, a Houndour, a Minim. Find that Roselia in the situations we need to find the Roselia in. Something I do want to note with Roselia is I found there is situations where outside of just Flick Poisoning, like say a Blastoise or something they can't retreat, I found I can Pure Power something within 10 damage of getting knocked out, especially like an EX, for example. And then I know that's always a possible prize on the bench with either a second Medicham or just a Roselia and Flick Poison. So that can be a very strong combo as well. We do play only 3 Great Ball, where you'll see 4 Great Ball and other turn 2 style decks because they're able to take advantage of APOM. And it's very easy for, let's say, like Arcanine EX, for example, to be able to use Great Ball in the early game to set up, and then in the mid to late game, Great Ball can just be a free prize or a free draw off of APOM. since we are relying heavily on Medicham EX, that's not necessarily something that we can rely on. So we go with one less Great Ball because we're not playing that Ape-Home. Energy lineup, I think you have a ton of room to do different things in the energy lineup. The deck is not super energy intensive. And what I mean by that is Pure Power is just 2 colorless, so you can even fill that requirement with like 2 multi. And then Sky Kick is just 1 fighting and 2 colorless, so you could do fighting multi. It's very hard for you to get mismatch energy or to need a certain energy and not have it already. So you have a lot of diversity here. I do think you could even make some arguments to play Houndoom, Fire Energy in the deck for Houndoom. Generally, I don't, because I don't want to risk the Houndoom, especially in the active spot. And most things in the format that are fire weak, that we would want to use Houndoom against, like Metagross Delta, for example, Medicham EX already deals with really well. But essentially, we're playing 7 fighting energy for the Medicham, 4 multi. This combo is either with the Medicham, the Houndour, or the Negative Spark on Plusle, which can be very useful in certain matchups like Rocklock, for example, Mulock, anything that's very body heavy. Negative Spark can be very good against. And then once again, 3 Lightning also for those minimum. The one thing I do want to note here is we do play that 14 energy plus the Holland's Electrode. It can be very key to make sure that we have, we want to be making sure that we're getting our energy drops in every single turn. We don't want to find ourselves behind on energy drops. So we do play a little bit higher energy than maybe you'll see in other decks, but a pretty common number, I would say, for a turn 2 style deck. So things this deck is going to be weak to, like with any Houndoom variant, once players kind of realize what the deck is and what your strategy is and what you're playing, me making YouTube videos on this probably doesn't help. They'll get better about playing against it. I found in a lot of games that I've been testing this deck in, my opponent won't necessarily realize that I'm playing the Houndoom right away or realize what my strategy is right away. So they'll instantly fill their bench or fill their bench enough where I can lock Houndoom into play. And unlike other decks, for example, like Nidoqueen, where if you had a Houndoom and Nidoqueen, they can basically just kind of time the knockouts or play smart, where eventually that lonesome Pokebody will be turned off. However, with this deck, as soon as I have that Houndoom lock in play, you are never playing items again until the end of the game, where I'm taking like 4, 5, 6 prizes in one turn. So they're never going to get out of that Houndoom lock once you have it into play. The other thing the deck can be weak to is decks that can drag stuff up. Dragtrode, for example, it can get very annoying if they are constantly dragging up the Houndoom. I've thought about playing Fluffy Berry in this to kind of alleviate some of that. The drag off for like 20 damage, for example, if they have a special dark on a Rocket Sneasel, really isn't super impactful if you just get to free retreat it back. Like I said, not an ideal situation. The other thing is, against decks that play a lot of Ida supporter, like Mr. Brainy's Compassion, for example, can be very annoying for the deck to play against. But essentially, if your opponent doesn't know how to play against this deck, it's basically a free win. If they're a little bit better about playing against Houndoom, the matchup is going to be much tougher. That being said, though, in the 2006 format in particular, there is just so many decks that you were going to have favorable matchups against regardless, because so many decks rely so heavily on powers. Decks like Meta Knight, for example, Ludi Cargo, even decks like LBS and Dragtrode can be, those are going to be closer matchups, but they can still be very favorable matchups just because how much setup is required, how many good POW targets you have in those matchups. So it is, like I said, it's a very fun deck to play. It's a very strong lock deck. You have a lot of different options with it. It's very annoying to play against. So it's definitely my style of deck, but it's not without its weaknesses in the format as well. But that's going to go ahead and wrap up the deck profile. If you enjoyed this content, please make sure to like the video, like and subscribe to the channel. I've absolutely loved seeing the channel grow, and I'd love to continue to see it grow. I hope everybody is getting as much, I guess, help and information out of this video as I'm learning so much about making videos, doing video content, stuff like that. So I hope you guys enjoyed it, but I hope to see you in the next video.